The audio file that would destroy Richard Hammond's career was sitting in my laptop, crystal clear and damning, as he stood at the podium accepting his Diversity Leader of the Year award. 3 months of secret recordings had captured every vile word he thought no one would ever hear. My name is Frank Williams, 28 years old, and until that moment I was the only black marketing analyst at Pinnacle Consulting Group in downtown Chicago. I'd endured 18 months of Richard's perfectly crafted public persona while documenting the monster he became behind closed doors. But tonight, everything would change. I watched him smile for the cameras, spouting rehearsed lines about inclusion and equal opportunity. The same man who'd told his inner circle last week that we need to be careful about hiring too many of them was now being celebrated as a champion of diversity. The irony tasted like bile in my throat. What Richard didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment since the day he called me surprisingly articulate in my first team meeting. Tonight, the recording would go live. Working for Richard Hammond was like navigating a minefield wrapped in corporate pleasantries. On the surface, he was everything a modern executive should be: progressive, inclusive, supportive of diverse talent. He posted the right things on LinkedIn, attended every diversity seminar, and made sure the company's promotional materials featured faces that looked like mine. But the mask always slipped in private. "Frank, great work on the Peterson analysis," he'd said during my 6-month review, his tone dripping with condescension. "You really exceeded my expectations for someone with your background." The pause before background was deliberate, calculated. I'd learned to recognize these microaggressions, the way he'd question my qualifications while praising my natural athleticism during company sports events, the way he'd ask if I was sure I understood complex concepts he'd never question with my white colleagues. I'd been the top performer in my MBA class at Northwestern, held 3 internships at Fortune 500 companies, and consistently delivered results that outperformed the entire department. But to Richard, I would always be the diversity hire he'd been pressured to bring on board. The breaking point came during a strategy meeting in October. Richard thought he'd closed the conference room door, but it hadn't latched properly. I was returning from the bathroom when I heard voices inside. Richard's voice specifically, talking about the upcoming promotion cycle. "Look, I'm all for diversity," he was saying to his senior team, "but we can't compromise standards just to hit some quota. Williams is decent enough, but let's be realistic about his ceiling here." I froze in the hallway, my blood turning to ice, but there was more. "These people," Richard continued, and I could hear the disgust in his voice. "They want everything handed to them. No work ethic, always playing the race card when they don't get what they want. I've seen it 100 times." Sarah Chen, our operations director, cleared her throat uncomfortably. "Richard, that's not really appropriate." "What? I'm just being honest. You think I'm wrong? Look at his numbers versus Reynolds. Similar output, but Reynolds has that killer instinct, that drive. Williams is just soft. Typical." That's when something shifted inside me. Not anger exactly, something colder, more focused. I'd spent my entire career being twice as good to get half as far, and now I was listening to the man who controlled my future, casually dismantling my character based on nothing but prejudice. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Over the next 3 months, I documented everything. Richard had a pattern. He'd save his most toxic comments for small groups of trusted lieutenants, usually during informal strategy sessions or after-hours drinks. He felt safe with his inner circle, comfortable enough to let his guard down completely. The recordings were devastating. Richard discussing how to manage the optics of promoting minorities without actually giving them real power. his theory that diversity initiatives were just virtue-signaling bullshit that hurt the company's competitiveness. His casual use of terms that would make a 1950s businessman blush. But the most damaging recording came from a client dinner in December. Richard was entertaining executives from a major automotive company, trying to secure a multi-million-dollar contract. The conversation had turned to workforce planning when Richard made his pitch. "Look, we understand the political climate," he said, his voice slightly slurred from expensive wine. "Everyone wants to check the diversity boxes, but here at Pinnacle, we focus on results. We'll give you the window dressing you need for your annual reports, but the real work gets done by people who understand excellence." The client looked uncomfortable, but Richard pressed on. "Between you and me, some of these diversity hires, they're not exactly the brightest bulbs, but they photograph well for the company newsletter, if you know what I mean." I knew I had him. The Diversity Leader of the Year award ceremony was perfect timing. The Chicago Business Journal was honoring executives who'd made significant contributions to workplace inclusion, and Richard's carefully crafted public image had earned him a nomination. He'd been preparing for weeks, talking about the speech he'd give about the importance of equal opportunity. I sat in the audience watching him bask in the applause, knowing that in 30 minutes everything would change. I'd scheduled the first recording to go live on the company's internal Slack channel at exactly 9 p.m. during the networking portion of the event. The plan was simple. Release the evidence gradually, letting each revelation build on the last. Start with the most damning content to establish credibility, then follow with a steady stream of supporting evidence. By morning, Richard's career would be over, and everyone would know exactly who he really was behind the diversity theater. My phone buzzed. 9 p.m. The recording was live. Within minutes, the Slack notifications started flooding in. Colleagues were sharing the audio files, their shock and outrage spreading through the company like wildfire. I watched Richard's assistant frantically checking her phone, her face growing pale as she listened to her boss's real opinions about the people he claimed to champion. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard was saying from the podium, completely unaware that his world was collapsing in real time. "Diversity isn't just the right thing to do. It's essential for business success when we embrace different perspectives." The irony was exquisite. By 9:15, the recordings had spread beyond our company. Someone had forwarded them to the Chicago Business Journal's social media manager, who'd immediately pulled the live stream. Other attendees were checking their phones, whispers spreading through the crowd like a virus. Richard noticed the change in energy, the way conversations had stopped and people were staring at their devices. His confident delivery began to falter as he saw faces in the audience, faces that had been smiling moments earlier now looking at him with disgust and disbelief. The final blow came when his own phone started buzzing on the podium, text after text, call after call, as board members and clients demanded explanations. The award ceremony devolved into chaos as journalists approached other attendees for reactions to the leaked recordings of Pinnacle Consulting's executive. Richard tried to finish his speech, but his voice cracked as he read from his notes about building bridges and celebrating our differences. The audience had stopped listening. Half the room was already heading for the exits. The aftermath was swift and brutal. By midnight, Pinnacle's board had called an emergency meeting. By morning, Richard was on administrative leave pending a full investigation. By the end of the week, he'd been terminated for cause, his severance package voided, and his reputation destroyed beyond repair. The clients started pulling contracts immediately. The automotive deal he'd been so confident about canceled within hours with a public statement about incompatible values. 3 other major accounts followed suit by Friday, but the real justice came from watching the company transform. Sarah Chen was promoted to interim CEO and immediately began implementing the changes Richard had only pretended to support. The diversity initiatives became real priorities with actual budgets and accountability measures. As for me, the board offered me Richard's position, a promotion that was long overdue and finally based on merit rather than optics. I accepted not for revenge, but because someone needed to ensure this never happened again. Richard tried reaching out once, 6 months later, a pathetic email about misunderstandings and context and how his words had been taken out of proportion. I deleted it without responding. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying someone who wronged you. It's proving that their prejudices were not just morally bankrupt, but strategically stupid. The company they thought would suffer from real diversity actually thrived once their toxic influence was removed. The recordings didn't just expose one man's racism, they revealed the cost of allowing bigotry to masquerade as leadership. And sometimes that's a lesson worth teaching, no matter how many Diversity Leader of the Year awards they've collected.